Admiral James Stavridis. Let's give him a hand. Bring him on out. A Naval Academy grad, of course, 4-star admiral, and served 4 years as the 16th Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, where he oversaw operations in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and the Balkans, as well as the piracy issue off the coast of Africa. Currently, by the way, he was vetted to be Hillary Clinton's running mate in 2016. I don't know whether he feels that's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's a hard thing.
The hard thing, the vetting process, yes. He's not over it. And he's currently the 12th dean at the Fletcher School, a post he assumed in 2013. Welcome, Admiral. Next to him will be Jeremy Bash. Come on out, Jeremy. Jeremy has the distinction of being the only Obama administration official to be a chief of staff at 2 different national security departments. And it's not like 2 unheard of departments. One is called the Department of Defense. The other one is called the CIA. So I would say, Mr. Bash, if he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's fooled a lot of us, that's for sure. Currently, he is founder and managing director of Beacon Global Strategies. Next to him, Ambassador Mike McFaul. Come on out, Mike. For our purposes tonight, he served 5 years in the Obama administration. First, he was a special assistant to the president dealing with Russian affairs on the National Security Council. And then he became U.S. ambassador to Russia for the United States during the transition between Dmitry Medvedev and Mr. Putin. And he and Vladimir are very close these days. Currently,
we're not Facebook friends.
Yes, you're not Facebook friends. He pokes, though, a lot on Facebook, doesn't he? Currently, you can always see Mike McFaul. He's always got that lovely background, Stanford University, because he is, of course, a professor of political science at Stanford. And I learned tonight, apparently one of their most effective football recruiters. So how about that? Very nice. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Wendy Sherman. Come on out, Wendy. Among many things that she has done in her illustrious career, she led the U.S. negotiating team that reached the nuclear deal with Iran and the P5+1. Look at that. Not many places you get rounds of applause for the Iran nuclear deal.
We've now correctly identified the political spectrum here.
And we're on the Upper East Side, I have to say, you know. On that, sorry if anybody.
It's okay.
Never mind. I don't know my parochial.
I'm a member of the tribe. It's fine.
Me too. She served also in the State Department. Currently, she is senior counsel at Albright Stonebridge Group as well. So welcome to all of you. The goal tonight is to try to deal with this. I think when we think about this first 9 months of the Trump administration, there's been obviously we've had a shakeup in our culture, shakeup domestically in politics, and there's a lot of focus on that. But if there's a long-term change that's taking place that's gotten, I think, not enough attention, it's America's role in the world. And so that's the goal of having this discussion tonight, and within that, how do we deal with North Korea? How do we deal with Iran? How do we deal with Russia? How do we deal with China? So that's a lot that we're going to try to tackle. But let me start with that larger question here. How much has changed as far as the world is concerned about how they view the United States in 9 months? And since it's an introductory question, I'll let everybody get one shot at this, and then we're just going to, we've all promised we're just going to have a nice conversation. So, Admiral, take it away.
You know, I'm going to begin by taking us back 100 years ago. So World War I is ending. We're in an era of great power competition. We're coming out of an apocalyptic war on the European peninsula. Probably 20 million people have died, and United States faces a pivotal choice. We either engage in the world, we join the League of Nations, we bolster our trading relationships, we build off what we've accomplished, or we reject the League of Nations, the forerunner to the United Nations, we retreat to America, We create an isolationist regime. We erect walls, barriers, trade barriers, Hawley-Smoot tariffs. We come home. Choice. We took the choice to come home. And today, as we look back on that time, we ought to examine, how did that choice come out for us? We came home, barriers, we isolated ourselves, we walked away from this world. We cracked the global economy, we created Great Depression. It creates the conditions that start fascism, and we stumble into a second world war in which 60 million people will die. We ought to keep that in perspective, and to answer the question, I'm concerned with the idea that we can somehow retreat from the messiness, the difficulty, the challenges of the world. It's the wrong strategy for us. We've tried that path. We ought to continue to engage in the world.
Jeremy, is the order, is the sort of the post-World War II liberal democratic order coming to an end?
No, but I think it's under duress, and I think it has worked to our advantage. And the one coda I will add to what Jim said is that nationalism as an ideology undermines one of America's great strategic assets, which is our network of alliances around the world and our ability to take advantage of that liberal, rules-based international order that has frankly been a source of our strength, a source of our growth, a source of our prosperity, and ultimately a source of our security. I think nationalism, in my view, and this goes a little bit to the great power politic dynamic that we're seeing in the world, and I know we're going to talk about Russia, but nationalism, if you think about it, is sort of a Russian ambition, because whenever Russia has been able to deal with other countries on a bilateral basis, they feel like they may have a fighting chance. But when they have to deal with us in the context of NATO or us in the context of multilateral organizations, that's when they feel like they're back on their heels. And I believe that nationalism, in other words, every country for itself, is sort of what they want. And then one final point, Chuck, which is nationalism is also about breeding division and divisiveness in our own country. And for the Russians, nothing could be better.
Mike, you teach this now. So are we, do you share the view of Admiral Stavridis? Are we essentially seeing history repeat itself? Because I'd seen an analysis that said, you know, in the late 19th century, democracy was on the rise, authoritarianism was on its way, was on the decline. And then literally with the one thing I would say that I would have added to yours is basically as we were transitioning from an agrarian to an industrial economy, that's when the shakeup began. Is that what we're experiencing right now, globally, as we transition now from industrial to whatever this is?
Well, there are different things happening at the same time. But before I get to that, I just want to say I'm really excited to be here with all these NBC folks. I am, first and foremost, a professor. I've been a professor for 3 decades. To me, facts matter. To me, hypotheses matter. To me, analysis matters. And that's what they do at NBC. And look at this team that we have here. So thank you, Chuck, and thank you for NBC for having us.
All right. Well, Phil, we'll renew the contract.
Yes.
I know you weren't sure.
Now,
No, I think
later.
this is who is the real ambassador in the crowd.
Nice diploma.
I actually,
Now pick our pocket.
I really believe that, and there's a lot of, well, never mind. Let's not talk about the other networks and the non-analysts and the non-fact-based discussions that happen way too often in this country. Some facts, yes. That was a pivotal moment in America's history after World War II. Before that, we had a debate about whether to be engaged or not, all the way back to our founding fathers. Most of the time, before World War II, it didn't matter because we didn't have any power to do much about it, except for the horrible, tragic interregnum that you talked about between the 2 world wars. After World War II, and of course in the beginning of the Cold War, we had a lot of power and a lot of responsibility that came with that. Through this period, and I think it's important to remember this historic fact, it hasn't been just continuity of American engagement through the Cold War, post-Cold War order, and now. There's been periods of expansionism and then retrenchment. If you're watching the series on the Vietnam, you see a period of retrenchment and it goes back and forth. I was in the Obama administration officials here, we were part of what I would call a retrenchment period. And the American people said, and the president listened, and if he were here, he would say, we were doing too much in the world, we had to pull back. What's different about Trump is he's radical on everything. He's radically, there's another debate about realists and liberals we'll get to maybe a little bit later, but he's a radical on all that. So he's a retrenchment guy and an isolationist guy that doesn't believe that engagement can help us achieve our outcomes, that doesn't believe that multilateral institutions can help us achieve our outcomes. And that, I think, is what's dangerous about his ideology. I'm an America First guy. I believe in America first. I don't know a single American president that didn't think America's national interest should be first. So that's a red herring. That stupid debate is a red herring. How do you achieve it? Do you achieve it through it's really hard to do things in government, by the way. Oh, that's one thing I learned in government. To have a giant achievement like the one that Wendy did, that's a good thing done in a multilateral context, advancing our interests. He doesn't believe that. Now, to even assign beliefs to the president, I think is let's be careful. I don't know what he believes. And I say that as a statement of somebody who watches him pretty closely. But that's what he says. That, I think, is dangerous. The good news is that we are not a dictatorship. We're not an autocracy. One person, the President of the United States, matters a lot. But there are a lot of other actors in this game. Some in his own government, some within our democracy. There's something called the U.S. Congress and independent media and civil society. That's you all here. You all get a vote in this. Oh, and by the way, there are other actors in this international system that also get a vote about whether we just walk away from things. He's walked away from some tragic things that I think are stupid, like the Paris Accord, the TPP deal. But my prediction is that over time, we're not going to be able to go in the most radical way that he personally at least articulates.
Wendy, and I say this because I think what happens with the Iran agreement could really sort of shake up sort of how the world sees the United States. But what is the world? Do some of these world leaders see it the way Mike sees it, which is, well, there are other entities here that are going to restrain this president? Or do some world leaders think, they may, but he's winning the battle, he's winning the PR battle?
I think there are several things going on here. I've been doing national security and foreign policy now for 30 years, but as I just said to the head of programs here at 90 Second Y, my training is a social worker, a community organizer, and I just say my caseload has changed over time. And my clinical skills come in very handy with dictators and members of Congress. But I look at people around the world, not just in the United States, and what's happening in our country is actually happening all over the world. The pace of change is quite radical and quite profound, both in terms of social mores and the issues that really go across borders and affect people's lives, whether that's climate or pandemics or cyber or artificial intelligence and the way we're going to work in the future, something Mike's been working on. Things are going to change, and people's anxiety is great. They like what comes from technology. You know, our kids love that they can talk to each other without ever getting on a telephone with each other or talking to each other face to face. They love it. But people feel unanchored, particularly people that aren't of the youngest generation. And that unmooring has created great anxiety and fear. And we've seen that in all the Pew Global Attitude studies that have been done, all the surveys around the world. That anxiety is profound, that modernity is somehow going to take away my identity and my place in the world. Well, there are two ways to respond to that fear. One is to be expansive and to be inclusive and to build on alliances and say, this is a problem that the whole world faces, and the way to take care of our interests is to work and play well with others. I'm for that approach. The other approach is to play to that fear, to play to those divisions, to play to that sense of isolationism, to draw up the bridges and say that alliances don't matter. This talk of sovereignty, of course sovereignty matters. The whole post-World War II set of institutions is built on the concept of sovereignty. The United Nations is a collection of member states. It isn't a thing. It's every single one of those individual member states. But the challenges we have, which we learned in 2008 when we had the recession, where our economy is not decoupled from China's and China's isn't decoupled from ours, is we're all in this together. And if we don't understand that, and if we don't walk across those borders and reform and encourage these institutions that were built after World War II, we're going to be in a peck of trouble.
All right, so the president no matter what you think of his foreign policy, I would argue at his UN speech at least gave a coherent vision of how he sees it. Is there anything in there that any of you see that you liked?
Well, I agree with you, Chuck. I think it was a coherent view. It's not one I share, and there were code words in that speech that I found very disturbing. When you talk in a speech at the United Nations about culture, you're not talking about respect for the different way that people live. It's code word for saying they're them and they have that set of values and we're us and we don't want them here. And it was really about immigration and the movement of peoples and any sense that we had any responsibility as a country to be who we are. Every one of us up on this stage, our families came from somewhere else. So it's a tough speech.
Yeah.
I would just add to that. I actually worked on President Obama's first speech at the UN General Assembly and talking to Ben Rhodes, a former colleague of ours, about the contours of that. Go check it out. I think that was a great speech, in my opinion. I was just a marginal player. But the big difference between the two speeches, and by the way, it's instructive to go back and look at it. The big difference is the objectives of what we want to see done in the world are not that different. I mean, we can argue in the margins.
He did sort of have the same goals. Yeah, he did outline.
The goals were kind of the same. The strategies for achieving them are where there's a big departure. And fundamentally, he wants to achieve them either by pulling back and us doing it by ourselves, and it's consistent with his worldview, of not engaging in negotiation or multilateral institutions to achieve those outcomes. And so, now we get to prove which strategy is right. I'm very skeptical of his approach, especially in the world that we're in, that Wendy just described. I believe in win-win outcomes and leveraging our power through our alliances, through multilateral institutions. I'm also struck by how, aside from those two I just mentioned, and we're going to get to North Korea, I'm sure, we're going to get to Iran. I'm actually even Iran I would put in the category of continuity. I'm struck by, that's what he says, but the actual policies have not changed as radically as you might. If you're just reading what Donald Trump said, you would think that we've had a radical departure in terms of what we're doing in the world. But if you look at Russia, you look at Iran, we're not going to walk away from the Iran deal. If he does, your partners are going to stay there. I mean, that's locked in because of your genius, by the way, because of Obama's genius. That's locked in. He can't do that. He can't do a trade war with China. He can't walk away from NATO. Those are things he cannot do. There are places that really worry me. North Korea worries me the most. But I see more continuity there than change because of he's not being able to do what he says he wants to do.
Let's look at a signature theme of the Trump administration in this regard, and that would be building a wall. So he talks a lot about building this big, beautiful wall.
We have a wall. Remember that. Continuity.
It's going to be 100 feet, and it's going to run 1,800 miles. Now, we can build that wall. We'd probably have to buy the cement from Mexico and get some of the labor from Mexico. But I'll tell you two things about the wall that we ought to remember, which pick up what Wendy and Mike are saying. One, here's a news flash. You can build that wall. Right? I'm an admiral. Right to the left of it is an ocean. People are going to find ways to come around walls. Won't worry. You can. How do you think
Unless
how do
you're
you
Puerto
think
Rico,
the
then it's
2
tough to get
million
there.
2 million refugees got to Europe? They came across the Aegean. So it's ineffective. And then secondly, campaign theme. Who's going to pay for the wall? The Mexicans. Listen, it used to be there were two things that were certain in life, death and taxes. Now there's three, death, taxes, and the Mexicans aren't paying for the wall.
By the way, he now said the other day in Alabama, he did this and it was like it got missed.
It's amazing.
The other day in Alabama, when he did his NFL riff, he also talked about, oh, by the way, the wall's already kind of there. And, and he also said, he goes, there are parts of the 2,000 mile, there's some natural barriers.
Called a river.
And then he also said, we need to have the wall to be see-through.
Yes, I thought
It means it's a fence. Anyway.
right.
He has now endorsed a fence. which is, I believe, what
mostly already
Hillary
there.
Clinton and Barack Obama voted for when they were in the United States Senate.
Yeah,
Jeremy,
and the fundamental point here is we are not going to succeed building walls. We need to build bridges.
Jeremy, can you say anything positive about his speech in the UN? Is there a part of what he is doing here that you think, you know what, it's not the way I would do it, but all right, I'd like to see how that works?
No.
It's Joe Biden-esque of you.
Look, I think, let's turn to North Korea for a moment.
I was just about to, so good segue.
I think any sober analysis of the security situation has to conclude that the acceleration of the North Korean missile and nuclear program has outpaced what I think those of us who served in government expected, what the intelligence community assessed, and that it presents this administration and this national security team with the kind of challenge that I wouldn't wish on anybody and is very deadly serious. And so to talk about the threat in sober terms is correct. To talk about the concerns that the international community should have about the North Korean work on its program is correct. I think working through the UN to put additional sanctions and the unilateral sanctions that the administration put on, I think were tough. I think those were good steps and important steps, and I would have agreed to it if anybody asked my opinion. The part, Chuck, of course, that I think is problematic is the rhetoric, the bombast, the taunt, which, because you're president, and when you're president, your word is a deed, that is a deed that can cause miscalculation and can cause us to fall into a military conflict that we may not seek. And so, you know, let's talk about North Korea, but I think the one thing, if I could just agree on, is that this is a very serious national security crisis.
I'm curious on North Korea. It was pretty clear that during the transition, this was the issue President Obama stressed the most to then President-elect Trump.
Indeed.
And in fact, that famous, when the two of them are there and he's hosting them, and then President-elect Trump just has this like, oh my, what have I gotten myself into look. I mean, he seemed as if he had seen a ghost. And it wasn't because he just found out the White House staff he doesn't inherit it. Like, he got this, what was he told? So, because there's been this theory out there that is Kim Jong-un testing Trump, or would President Clinton have had the same Kim Jong-un that he mindset, right?
Yes, well, I think part of the reason Chuck's looking towards me is that during the Clinton administration, I was towards the end of the administration, what was called the Special Advisor to the President and Secretary of State and North Korea Policy Coordinator, better known as SAP-ass. A title
Really?
Really. Title I really loved. So, along with being counselor of the department, and I went to North Korea twice and was with Madeleine Albright on her historic trip to meet with Kim Jong-il. So I spent about 12 hours with the then leader, the father of Kim Jong-un. And I think President Obama told President-elect Trump very soberly that this was the most serious security challenge he was going to face, bar none. And it is. What I think has happened, I think this would have been difficult for any president. I don't think there's any question about that. But I also agree with what my colleagues have just said, which is that this has happened at an accelerated pace. And some of that acceleration is because this young dictator believes he must accelerate the pace, and that was his plan, but part of it is because of this escalatory cycle in the rhetoric. It is not only that the president's words are deeds, but we are the big country. We are the superpower. They're this little country, and yes, they have nuclear weapons, but they're this failed state in every other way. They fail their people, they starve their people, they brutalize their people, there is no food, there is no economy to speak of. They're isolated, they're cut off from the world. There are no human rights. And we are acting like we are them. And because it is a cult, not a country, it is more like a cult than a country. And Kim Jong-un is like a god in that country. He has no choice but to respond to Barack Obama, which he would have done too, but he Barack Obama would have never said these things. He has to respond to Donald Trump when Donald Trump calls him Rocket Man. He must, personally. He takes it personally. And you start in an escalatory cycle. And let me just add one quick thing, follow up on what Jeremy said. My greatest fear is an accident. Is like the EP3 incident in 2001, 10 weeks after George Bush had become president, where there was a mid-air collision between a US intelligence plane and a fighter jet by the Chinese. Mid-air collision, fighter jet pilot died. Our 20-some crew member ended up on an island in China. It could have been a total disaster. And I give George Bush credit. He handled an incredibly difficult situation well. We got our sailors back. We got our plane back eventually in pieces, but we did get it back. And lives were saved. But if a B-1B bomber that we put up in international airspace is buzzed by a bad aircraft from North Korea, because they're all bad, and there is a crisis, think about how President Trump will respond. And that scares the dickens out of me.
So it feels, Mike, do you think we have we cornered ourselves right now in North Korea? Or I'm trying to figure out, where is the diplomatic urgency on our end? I mean, I know there's a desire in the State Department. I know there's a desire in the National Security Council, but I don't know if there's a desire on the president's part yet. Where is this sort of the, oh my God, let's get the shuttle diplomacy going? Where's the urgency?
So 2 things I'd say on this. First of all, just to echo what Wendy said about the probability of crisis, misperception, escalation happens in moments like that. So of all those things I said, you should be reassured. We have these institutions, we have these grown-ups, we have civil society. This is one place where 2 actors who have a proclivity to be erratic about the things they say, that fuels misperception. I was only a diplomat for a little while. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on diplomacy, but I have some at Stanford with me. George Shultz is one of them. And one of the things George always says is there are going to be times when countries are going to disagree, going to have different interests. We can never have conflict based on misperception or a miscalculation about the other side's interests. And that worries me in this regard. The second piece that worries me, and I think not to keep going back to the Iran deal, but it's a great deal. You were reminding me from my first days in the White House. I remember January 21st, 2009, that first day opening up my inbox. I used to deal with Russia, and suddenly it was like, holy, you're right, there's a lot of scary things happening out there. But I also remember we set out some strategies, big ideas, big objectives, and then strategies for achieving them. And from the very get-go, from early spring 2009, we had a comprehensive, multi-pronged strategy for that Ambassador Sherman and others eventually did the final leg to. It was a combination of things. It was both pressure to get to negotiation, right? We laid it all out. That's why I was part of it. We had to get sanctions, UN Security Council Resolution 1929 first to put pressure onto the Iranians, but there was always a kind of multi-pronged strategy of how to use coercion and negotiation to achieve an outcome. The problem right now I see, and I no longer live in Washington, so I'm farther away than others, but the problem I see from afar is, number one, we have not agreed on our strategic objective. And this is difficult. By the way,
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
is the goal a denuclearized Korean peninsula?
That's what everybody says, and there's no way of achieving that.
Okay,
So
that
that's the truth, and I'd be curious if Wendy agrees with me, but when I look at this situation,
it's too late, right?
there's no let's just talk about the other guy's interests. There is no rational way for him to denuclearize in the short term. And to make that your goal, therefore, I think, what is the strategy for achieving that? That is going to lead to failure. So that's number one. Right? We have to change the goal. And number two,
overtly, publicly?
I hope not.
Well,
you wouldn't change it publicly.
No, I would not. I would
That's
not.
the kind
Even
of
if
the problem
containment
there.
is the most likely.
No, I'm probably where Jeremy is, and I think probably Jim as well, which is the goal should be denuclearization, or we're going to encourage Japan and South Korea to go out and get nuclear weapons to protect themselves. Do I think that is achievable in any near term? I do not. But do I think you should attempt to do it? I do. I agree with you. I think the State Department, such as it is, since it's been completely decimated in this administration, it almost doesn't exist. But I do think that Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis, Chief of Staff Kelly, McMaster want dialogue with North Korea. I don't have any question about that.
To achieve what, though? Just to be clear.
To get in there, and maybe in the first instance it's a freeze. In the first instance it was a freeze with Iran in the interim deal that we had. But we didn't take away the long-term objective with Iran in that process. And I think the problem the administration's having, and then I will shut up, the problem the administration's having is you cannot wait for North Korea to behave well for some interval before you start dialogue. They're not going to now. It is not in their interest to behave nicely for a while to get into dialogue. We have to put something on the table to get there, and there are many things we could.
Why do we refuse to go to deal with them one-on-one, Jeremy? We seem to always have this, no, we have to talk in it has to be multi-party talks.
No, I think we're ready to talk one-on-one.
You think we are now?
Yes.
And I guess why aren't we doing more of it?
Kim Jong-un won't take the opportunity to talk to us directly because, in my view, he wants to achieve a threshold nuclear capability before he comes to the table, so he has a better hand.
So you're saying, because I had Ambassador Chris Hill, former South Korean ambassador, he just got back from South Korea today, and he was pushing back on this idea. He doesn't think they have the capability yet, but he does buy the idea that the capability will be there in about 2 years.
They have done 5 provocative things in the last interval of time. 2 overflights of Japan, 2 flight tests of an ICBM, and an underground 2-stage thermonuclear device test. They have a threshold capability. What they have not achieved is the ability to marry that nuclear weapon on top of an ICBM. The timelines are probably, I think, are in line with what Ambassador Hill suggested. But I think he wants to achieve that next stage of having a deliverable device, and then he'll come to the table.
Is he a rational actor?
He is. I think, he's
Referring
well,
to Kim Jong-un, by the way.
obviously.
No,
well-
I'm just referring to Kim Jong-un. I don't know
No,
what
we
you're
have
thinking.
two, I think it's worth pointing out, we have 2 leaders, both of whom are unpredictable, impetuous. They have really bad haircuts. They have a lot in common. And they both have nuclear weapons. But I think Kim Jong-un is well named. He's unpredictable, but he is not irrational. And within the context of the Shark Tank in which he was raised, he is pursuing 3 objectives. One is to attempt to unify the Korean Peninsula. The second is to gain international respect as a holder of nuclear weapons. And the third is to continue to lead this dystopian kingdom he's created. And I think strategically he's moving down those with a reasonable degree of rationality. Let me tell you 3 or 4 things that I think we ought to do in a practical basis. One, we ought to absolutely increase our missile defense, particularly in boost phase when these missiles take off. Number 2, we ought to spend a lot more time listening to South Korea. We spend all our time yelling at North Korea. We ought to listen more to South Korea, who understands us and understands the North. They're at the nexus of this problem, and I think they have pretty good advice to give us. Number 3, we ought to be, I think, using our naval capability for a maritime interdiction operation to begin to close this economy. Number 4, we should put precision-guided sanctions on China that encourage them to move in the right direction. I think if we did a package like that, we still have a 70% chance of a diplomatic conclusion. Here's the bad news. We have a 10% chance of a full-on war on this peninsula in which 1 million people are going to die. We have a 20% chance of an exchange of ordnance that may or may not lead to that 10%. We can still find our way to that 70% chance.
Let me ask you about 2 unintended consequences. Number 1, would we be in a better position today with North Korea if Gaddafi were still in power and were an example of somebody who gave up his nuclear ambition and joined the world of nations?
Yes, and would also have to unwind Saddam Hussein, kind of similar, and to some degree Ukraine, which gave up nuclear weapons, and today 1/4 of their territory is occupied by Russia.
So it's fair to say that Gaddafi's demise is pretty good rationale for Kim Jong-un to keep pursuing his weapons,
It's an
right?
old ghost that rattles, and he is very aware of it.
Yeah, I certainly think. Yeah,
I think it's rational for anybody. I really, I'm sorry. Under what conditions would a regime with an antagonistic relationship to the most powerful nuclear country in the world give up their nuclear weapons? I just, we can't say that. I agree. We can say it because we're not in government. I understand the political piece. And by the way, when I mean the political piece, I mean the intramural politics of Washington. You can't say that. But if that is your strategy, you are going to fail. I strongly believe that. We wanted a nuclear-free world. Barack Obama talked about that all the time. He gave another great speech in April 2009. Look it up. In Prague.
That one was in Prague. I
was in
remember
Prague.
that. That was a beautiful. We were in the square there.
gorgeous,
It's all
gorgeous.
yeah.
But you're not going to get to a nuclear-free world until you get the START treaty done. And that was always our strategy. And I firmly believe that's the only way out of this predicament. But how we talk about it politically, I take the point. It's different than how I can.
Wendy, you
as a Stanford professor.
you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say is I think Jim's suggestions of what we need to do is absolutely right. It goes to the point Mike made as well, that to do these things, you have to have a comprehensive all-of-government, all-of-the-world strategy. You have to use every tool in the toolbox and put them all together. And the Iran...
Meeting in that situation room every week, right?
Every single week.
I wonder how many NSCs they've had on North Korea.
Yeah.
Do you know?
They have a very different decision-making process. It's top-down. It's not bottom-up. And for those of you, just sort of the interworkings of government, during the administrations we all worked in, there would be an interagency working group, then it would go up to the deputies, then to the principals, and the president would join in a National Security Council meeting to make big decisions. Very well thought out strategy. And the reason it happened that way is that as brilliant as all the cabinet officials are, there are a lot of details they don't know, nor should they spend their time knowing, but they ought to be informed by them so they can make informed choices. This administration, to my understanding, you probably know better than I do, Chuck, is top-down. The principals get together, they sort of decide we want to go in this direction, and then they tell the troops to get them there.
Well, the staffers have to support the idea. Have to
They
come
have
up
to-
with the rationale to support
to
the
get
idea.
there.
Yes.
And that is pretty problematic in national security.
Jeremy, I want to ask, going further on unintended consequence, jump in, but then let me also try to answer this question, which is, what if it does, we always say we need China involved in the North Korea issue and all this stuff, and obviously there's there, but is there an unintended consequence if we can't solve the problem and China does, and the message that sends to the world, if we can't solve this problem on our own?
No, I think it's actually okay if we employ other partners, other allies in strategic contexts to help solve big problems. I am not worried about the message to the world that America can't solve the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula if we can smartly work with our allies in the region, Japan and South Korea, and some partners in the region like China to get it done. I'd take that deal. Just to sharply state the conundrum, though, if you put it all together, if in 6 weeks' time, or we get near the holidays, and American intelligence sees that the North Koreans have put up a missile with a fairing on top, so you cannot actually see what is on top of that missile, the warhead, and we don't know what it is, and our intelligence is murky. Maybe there's a stray report that it's some sort of potential nuclear-ish radiological device, but maybe that source is somewhat dubious. What do we do?
And something like this is likely to happen during the 19th Party Congress coming up in October.
How good is our intelligence, our human intelligence in North Korea, Jeremy?
Be careful how you answer that. Remember
know,
your
I mean-
clearances.
No, I mean, look, this was a concern in Iran for a long time, that we didn't have good human intelligence.
This is a very hard target. It is a police state. There is not the commercial or the diplomatic presence to allow for any country to get in and really understand what's happening on the ground. Their program is buried to some extent, physically and literally and metaphorically, and it is a very difficult intelligence target. So I just want to come back to the scenario I painted, which is that will be a decision for the President of the United States. Do we take out the missile on the pad? Do we try to rely on our national missile defenses, or maybe our boost phase missile defenses first, and then as a fallback, our national missile defenses with interceptors flying out of Alaska and Vandenberg in California to try to hit.
THAAD to help.
Well, no, this is
These are
national missile
GBIs.
defense.
National.
This is national missile defense out of Alaska, ground-based interceptors out of Alaska and California, which is, we tested it, but we've never actually had to do it for realsy. And or do we let them launch? I mean, what do we do? That is the most difficult question.
I want to go in further on this China front. So on one hand, everybody here would accept China playing this huge role, essentially saving us from a military confrontation with North Korea. But now, couple that with, Mike, you mentioned pulling out of TPP, and now it's China that's developing a trade pact essentially with most of those same Southeast Asian nations. And Admiral, let me start with you. Could, in 10 years, it's China that is sort of the setting the rules, the diplomatic rules of the road, the economic rules of the road? How possible is that scenario now?
The walking away from this Trans-Pacific Partnership, I would argue, is one of the worst things the Trump administration has done, along with the Paris walking away from the Environmental Accord. It fails strategically in terms of what you want to accomplish in the world, but it also fails tactically. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was an agreement to bring together Pacific nations, leaving China outside.
It was a check on China.
It was
right?
absolutely a hockey check on China up against the Ford wall. We have lost that. China will take it. Here's our counter.
Can you talk to Steve Bannon about this?
Who?
I mean, here's a guy who can't, he wants to make China, attacking China the problem, and he's the one that pushed the administration to pull out of our greatest weapon potentially against
Huge mistake. So we've got two comebacks. One is over time trying to reconstitute this, because in the end, free trade is a winner. There are pockets of pain. We need to adjust those. But broadly speaking, we can lift billions out of poverty and enhance our own economics. And then secondly, and maybe more importantly, as a geopolitical check in this century, we ought to look to India. The big flick in the 21st century, U.S., European Union, democratic values. China, our biggest competitor. Where does India end up? India can be that balancer. That's geopolitics 101 in the 21st century.
How concerned are any of you on this idea that China essentially could basically usurp us as sort of that power?
What's the time interval we're talking about, Chuck?
And basically, if we have a two-term Trump presidency, and it's 8 years of his, no, but because that's, all right,
Hey, with him, it might be a three-term,
Know your
four-term.
audience.
Who knows?
Know your
I didn't
audience.
think he was going to run, and I'm joking. I'm like, we're going to wake up in 2032 and go, how did he get a fourth term? But if his sort of view of the world, and we're in this sort of everything is a bilateral relationship, and China, meanwhile, very quietly as it's been doing, whether it's investing in South America, investing in Africa, now investing in partnerships, but it's on their terms. Do we wake up in 2032, or let's say 2025 with the next, and suddenly we're number two?
So I think I asked about the time because there's the way you think about short term and I do are somewhat different, and the way the Chinese think about it is also different, by the way. So the interregnum I was talking about,
They're worried about 2050, right?
they are, and
They're worried about 2250.
literally they are. I mean that I don't know about 2250, but literally about 20.
No, we think in 2, 4, 6 year
but
time frames. They think in dynasties.
But planning for 200 years is hard. Planning for 50 years is not. And all those things you mentioned, and there are many more, One Belt, One Road, their strategy for expanding their influence and power in the world is strategic. And it is happening. They're benefited, by the way, I would say an additional thing what we haven't talked about, by another thing that Trump doesn't do and doesn't talk about, which is he doesn't talk about values. He doesn't talk about democracy. And that's great for the Chinese model. It's great for the Iranians and the Russians too. But that used to be that normative ideological debate, which is fading. That's not good for us in the long term. The two questions, the way I would answer your question is twofold. In the short run, I'm not sure about Trump or not. The short run is hard for me to guess. In the long run, I would just remind you, we've had other periods in our history where it looked like we were the fading power and it was all over. 1950, if we're talking about China in our earlier period. Remember those maps? I see some bald heads out there. You remember those maps, right? Where the Soviet Union was red and then China was red and we were in a quagmire in Korea. It looked like that was the beginning of the end. That turned out not to be true. 70s was another period. The communists were rising. The Soviet Union was on parity with us. They were expanding in Indochina and Southern Africa and even in our hemisphere. That turned out to be a bad bet. Even lesser place just to remind you about how bad we are about predicting power. When I was in school, the #1 language that people studied was Japanese. Because in the early 80s, that was the #2 power. We all thought they're going to transfer that economic power into military power. That turned out to be a bad
In
bet.
1990, I went German. I thought that's with the language of the economy.
Well, that may still be a good bet, Chuck.
You all ought to be studying Spanish right now.
Well, that's inevitable.
But this relates. So I think we have the institutions for renewal that I'm confident in. I'm not confident in the short term that you're talking about. But but you mentioned another much bigger thing at the beginning, which is about the globalization, the post-industrial society. That big bet. I think that's a much harder, bigger question. Inequality right now is a part of that, especially in countries like our own. The Chinese they think they have a solution for that. It's called autocracy, it's called organized government, and that is the bet that I'm confident in the 30 to 50 year cycle. I'm not confident over the 100-year cycle.
Because I want to get to a few more regions of the world here, I don't weigh in on everything, but I want to go, Wendy, I want to do the Iran deal with you. All of you here are sounding as if you're reasonably confident we're not going to pull out of this deal. Are you reasonably confident that the United States is not going to pull out of this deal? And by the way, can we? I don't know one of the things I like to remind my friends that in the Trump administration is, the U.S. did not make this deal with Iran.
Right.
Yeah, essentially the world did.
Absolutely. The United Nations Security Council, even before the Congress finished its review, voted for this deal 15-0. And it then got the support of the UN General Assembly as well. So it was done by all of us, the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union. We're all at the table. There was no question, though, that this would not have gotten done without the Americans. No other Secretary of State put in the time that John Kerry did or that we did. And one of the things that's so demoralizing about the State Department and what's happening to it, just as an aside here, is part of our power is we have the deepest and broadest bench of any country in the world, or we have had. I'm not sure we do anymore at the rate we're going. So we come to the table prepared and with capabilities that no one else can bring to the table, and it gives us tremendous power in a negotiation. So to your question, Chuck, we can unravel the deal. It is not ours to kill alone. I think the betting is that the president won't certify this time. The irony is this law was passed by a Congress that presumed Hillary Clinton was going to be president, and they wanted a certification process to keep her in check. Now the President of the United States hates this certification process because every 90 days he has to turn to his supporters and certify it because they're complying with the deal, and he can't stand it. So if the Congress would change the legislation, I think he'd be perfectly happy. I don't think they're able to do that. You may have noticed, probably even more than I do, that the Congress hasn't been very good about passing anything. So it would be hard to see how they do this, but I would expect by October 15th, the president will have Secretary Tillerson not certify the deal to the Congress.
And what would that mean? So then what happens?
Then that means that it gets kicked to the Congress. They have 60 days to decide whether to reimpose the sanctions unilaterally, our sanctions. If they reimpose the sanctions, we chill terribly the commercial interests of everybody else in the world, because our secondary sanctions, which means that a bank in another country or commerce in another country that wants to do business with our banks, and everybody does, has to choose between our banks and continuing to have Peugeots and Renaults sold in Iran. or built in Iran. And they're going to choose American banks, and it will kill the deal. And Iran will see that as pulling out. And even the president's not certifying will be perceived as beginning to put the deal at risk. And what is the most disturbing about this is that it will give Iran high moral ground and put a wedge between us and Europe, which will make Russia and China very happy.
But Jeremy, one of the on the president's first foreign trip was, and the first place he went essentially was Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken.
Riyadh, yeah.
And I can't help but it felt as if it was the first time that the United States officially took sides in Sunni Shia. And how much is that giving this president the comfort, since Saudi Arabia, so basically all the Gulf countries and Israel are essentially goading him to do this? Doesn't that guarantee this happens because essentially we've decided to take the side of the Sunnis?
I think it's a thumb on the scale. I don't think it guarantees that it happens. I think there are other strategic interests. But there's no question that Iran deal or no Iran deal, there is a realignment of American foreign policy in the Middle East that is favoring the Sunni Arab countries and Israel, and in some sense hoping that actually they close ranks together and work together to counter Iranian influence in the region.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think there are things about that that are very good because Iran is doing a number of problematic things in the region. The question is, do you go so far as to alienate those inside Iran that might actually move that country in a better direction?
All right.
Just a
Go
thought.
ahead, and then I'm going
Sunni
to
Shia.
bring up the big red state.
Fine, Sunni Shia. We ought to not underestimate how long this goes on, because
You mean 1,000 years hasn't been enough?
I think in the Christian faith, we've seen this movie before, right? These are the wars of the Reformation. This is Protestant Catholics. In the 15th, 16th century, it kills a third of the population of Europe. It staggers along as a conflict today in Ireland. This will go on a long time because it's not only religious, Jeremy's point, there's a geopolitical overlay here. This is a permanent, more or less, muscle movement in the international system.
All right, before I get to, there's some really fun questions in here, and I want to get to, but I figured the last topic I'd save. It's last but not least, and it's Russia. Mike, I want to go at it this way. What was Vladimir Putin's reasons behind ordering the influence campaign in the United States? We're not going to get into the investigation, but I want to get into what was Putin's motivation. There's some long-term motivation, but also there was some grievance here too. You were there. What'd you see?
Well, what I saw is partially related to this and not, but let's focus on your question. Three big things, okay? First of all, you don't need a PhD in Russian studies. Actually, I don't have one in Russian studies. I have one in social studies. Not the sixth grade kind, but to read what the two candidates said as they were candidates and figure out that one candidate was saying things that were more preferable to Putin's definition of Russian national interests. I'm choosing that sentence very carefully because I disagree with it, and I know lots of Russians that disagree with it. But in his definition, Trump said more things that were better for him than Secretary Clinton. He said things like, I'll look into recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. I'll look into lifting the sanctions. I think NATO's obsolete. I don't like to talk about democracy and human rights. And very famously, on Morning Joe, in case anybody's forgetting who we're all affiliated with, December 2015, I remember it very vividly, and I'm writing about it right now. When he was asked about the Putin regime, he assigned a moral equivalency between the United States of America and Russia.
We've done some bad things too.
We've killed a lot of people too. Who are we to criticize them? Secretary Clinton said the exact opposite on all four of those things. So that's a no-brainer. He would support Trump. Number two, Vladimir Putin doesn't like Secretary Clinton. Read her book. Read the chapter on Russia. I was there for many of those meetings. And in particular, he doesn't like her, and he doesn't like our policy, because it wasn't just her, it was the Obama administration's policy, because he believes, erroneously, I want to emphasize, that we intervened in his parliamentary elections in 2011, that we tried to do certain things to shape the game against him.
What was his evidence on that?
Well, it's messy, right? So I'm glad you asked that. Did we give money to the opposition? The answer to that is no. Did we fund bots to say certain things on Twitter against him and his parties? The answer to that is no. Where the rubber hits the road is where we funded some non-governmental organizations. By the way, I was a part of that decision-making that we decided to do that for us were nonpartisan, ones that monitored elections. It's called GOLAS is the main one. USAID, through one of their intermediaries, they call them implementing partners, provided financial assistance to that organization. To us, that was just, we're for democracy, we're not choosing sides, we want free and fair elections in Russia. And oh, by the way, that used to be our policy around the world, that those kinds of grants go to organizations around the world. To Putin, that was direct interference in his electoral affairs. And then secondly, and I remember this very vividly because of the phone call that President Obama received the day after, we put out a statement, Secretary Clinton put out a statement, but I worked at the White House at the time and signed off on it. So we put out a statement, the Obama administration, that criticized the free and fairness of that parliamentary election. I'll tell you honestly, I thought it was a pretty innocuous statement. We put these out all the time, no big deal. I was watching my son play football, by the way, in Maryland, Chuck, at the time. You know how this is. You're like trying to find a quiet place to get on your BlackBerry to clear on the thing. It seemed like no big deal. It was fine. Putin thought it was a big deal. And so when he had the opportunity, an opportunity, by the way, in part created by us not being ready for it, he chose to take that opportunity to intervene. And then number three is just, he believes what Donald Trump said 2 years ago. We're basically the same, right? U nas u vas, if there's any Russian speakers out there. We're just like you, we're no different. So anything that he can do to kind of create chaos in our democratic process, to have us fighting amongst ourselves, to have crises, constitutional crises about whether a president should be impeached or not, that's a great thing for Vladimir Putin because it takes us off the international stage. We're fighting among ourselves and we're not engaged in the world. That's good for Putin.
By the way, how much was our investigation into Russian doping in the Olympics also part of this? And what about the release of the Panama Papers? Because another theory that those two things, which the Panama Papers, sort of the WikiLeaks for the world, and it mysteriously seemed to implicate a lot of world leaders, and nobody from the United States. So the implication was that somehow maybe we leaked those, and it exposed Putin as an enormously wealthy, and basically that he was now an oligarch too.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's all part of Putin's theory of the world. Putin believes that we are out to get him. Putin believes, and this is Democrats
By the way,
and Republicans.
Could he be right?
I think he's wrong about that.
Okay.
I think he's wrong about that. I think, I brought up that instance of Golis. I was an ambassador at the time. I had to go in and defend that policy. That's where there's some gray space there. Let's be clear. Okay. But fundamentally, Putin doesn't believe that there are autonomous non-governmental organizations or political leaders. He believes that the CIA is behind everything around the world. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Ukraine, Russian demonstrators, all of those things, which in my view, I'm not read into everything, but in my view had nothing to do with what we were doing in the world. We were reacting to those events just like everybody else. But when Putin sat down with the president to talk about that, he sees a hidden hand called the CIA, fomenting revolution all over the place. At the end of the day, ultimately with this focus on.
Spoken as a KGB guy.
Because that's his
Always a
worldview.
good reminder.
Exactly.
Jeremy, two things for you. Number one, were we slow was the U.S. intelligence community slow to understand what Russia was up to? One, and two, how much regret is there in the Obama administration that perhaps if we weren't slow, we didn't sound the alarm.
Yes, we were slow. I think part of the thinking was that Hillary was going to win and that her victory would be tainted if it came out that the Obama team had interceded to try to shut down activity that was benefiting Trump. And I think all things being equal, the president said, I can't get involved in an election. I just can't. It's not my place. It's not my providence. And oh, by the way, it will hurt actually the outcome that I seek. And so I think a lighter hand was used than in hindsight should have been used.
Is it the August 6th memo? Osama determined to strike the United States? I mean, is it that kind of miss now? Will history write it that way?
No, I
You
don't.
read Clinton's book yet?
I think I know where she stands on this.
He wrote the first draft of
Yes.
that history.
Yes.
No, I don't think it's that dire. I don't think it's about physical damage to the United States and loss of life and a clear warning, a set of warnings. I wouldn't put it in that category, Chuck. I wouldn't. But there were warning signs, and there were things that the United States could have done to counter the activity and to prepare better for it.
And let's be clear, I think the other piece of this was to, in part, reflect the book, that FBI Director Comey chose to make public an FBI investigation into emails and didn't make public an FBI investigation into Russia, which, from a national security perspective, was far more concerning. And perhaps because it had national security implications to it, people were more careful about it, because White Houses tend to be very careful about getting in the midst of FBI investigations or Justice Department decisions.
Can we just put this in a historical context, in the sense of Russia gravitates towards strong unitary leaders? In a sense, they kind of roll the cosmic dice. One time they get Ivan the Terrible, the next time they get Peter the Great. One time they get Stalin, the next time they get a Gorbachev. Those dice have landed. We can have a lot of panels about how terrible Vladimir Putin is. He's going to be in office until he dies. So the question is, what should we do about it? And I would argue what we don't want or need is to stumble into a full-blown Cold War. We're not quite there yet. We're very close. So we ought to be thinking, confront Russia where we must. Syria, support for a dictator. Ukraine, an invasion. Above all, as my colleagues have stated, the intrusions into our election. Confront where we must. We need to find some zones of cooperation with the Russian Federation, and
right.
there are potentially many.
But let me ask you this, as the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. What happens if Putin tests NATO's resolve in Estonia?
He will not. He will not.
Are you convinced of that?
I am. He will not cross a NATO border in an overt way, because the correlation of forces, military speak, we outnumber him immensely. Our budget is 10 times.
Isn't he willing to roll the dice to think that
I don't
President
think so.
Trump doesn't want to do it?
No, he has
About the
has
Balkans.
shown us, excuse me, he has shown us
I did Estonia.
He has shown us recklessness in Ukraine, Moldova, in Transnistria. He has rolled those dice, but I do not believe he will cross a NATO border with overt military action. However, he will use hybrid warfare to try and undermine these countries using the witch's brew that he's demonstrated to us. This is why it's so crucial that we maintain solidarity within the NATO alliance.
The rest of you that confident?
It is very interesting to me, in working with my European colleagues so closely through the Iran deal, that they said to me to a one that they were much more concerned about Russia than they were ever concerned about Iran.
All right.
I want to say that I think the president's approach on Russia, just to complete the thought, makes it more likely, Jim, that Russia will feel empowered and NATO will feel less secure. And I think that's the problem, which is the equilibrium that you've painted, I think, has been thrown off by Trump's pro-Putin stance.
By the way, ironically, has Putin made NATO relevant again?
You know,
Of course
you know,
Not to
I'm-
say NATO wasn't relevant.
I was just going to say, I'm
know,
the Supreme Allied Commander. I think NATO
but Putin has
continues-
helped, huh?
Putin is the best thing that's happened to NATO in 50 years.
But Chuck, just two more. We heard a worst case scenario on North Korea earlier, what was really riveting to me. Actually, we heard a worst case scenario on the Iran deal, which was sobering too. Let me give you two.
Good luck sleeping tonight, everybody.
Yeah, there are two scenarios that worry me about Russia. Russia's not going to roll tanks into Tallinn, that's for sure. But there are two scenarios that worry me. One in the Baltics and one in the Balkans. Okay, in the Baltics, here's a scenario that scares me about not Tallinn, but Narva. Little sleepy town on the border. Let's say a bunch of drunk Estonians get in a big fight with a bunch of drunk Russians. Now that I think about it, I've been in Tallinn and been hit by a drunk Russian in 1985. So this is not a hypothetical.
Like a start of a joke.
I just remembered.
Bad one, but anyway.
Okay. Some
Two
Russians get killed.
Latvians and a Lithuanian walk into a bar.
So some Russians get killed in the territory of Estonia, in a predominantly Russian town. Some Russian special forces come over the border, and they kill 3 Estonians, and then they go home. Tanks didn't roll into Tallinn. What does NATO do then?
This is hybrid warfare, yes.
Are we all ready to go to war with Russia over that? I'm not so sure. But then, and I'm not going to quiz you.
What if Estonia wants, what if they say, hey, Article 5?
The former president of Estonia works for me now at Stanford. That's what he wants.
Absolutely.
What are you all going to say? What are the Germans going to say? What are the Italians going to say? That's a scenario I worry about. And the other one, I'm not going to quiz you as a professor, but I'll bet you most people in this room don't even know what country just joined NATO recently. In the Balkans.
Montenegro.
Okay, Admiral. Yeah, okay. That's a place I worry a lot about. Russia has a lot of power in Montenegro. There's a lot of Russian investment there. What if the Russians pull off a successful coup in Montenegro? They flirted with one not long ago. Are we going to go to war over a country that I'll bet you 95, maybe 99% of Americans don't even know that that country is in NATO? Those are the places I worry about NATO's future.
All right, I'm going to get to some audience questions. Is America, from a domestic and foreign perspective, still considered leader of the free world? And I guess the second part would be, is Merkel taken the role of, well, the United States is still leader of the free world, the leading Western leader is Merkel. Do you guys buy any of that?
So I think there's no question that people saw Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, as leader of Europe, and still see her as the leader of Europe, though the recent election has definitely weakened her hold. She just got elected for a 4th term, but a far-right party got seats in parliament for the first time, and it will make her coalition building much more difficult. She has people now who don't believe in creating a stronger Europe, which is what she has been for and what we are for. And Macron, who is now the president of France and got there in part because he was an outsider, but also who believes in the European project, doesn't now have the partner he thought he might. Not because she doesn't believe it, and she's a very courageous person, but because she's got political issues. And the one other thing that one always has to remember about Germany, Germany's history is part of their daily life. And the Chancellor of Germany will never risk being the leader we might want her to be, because it makes the rest of Europe fear that Germany's past is reasserting itself. And this recent election is going to stoke those fears.
So suddenly her influence on Europe, you think, is actually going to start waning a little bit. And does that mean Macron rises?
Macron's going to try to rise. I don't know that he'll be able to, because France is in terrible trouble economically, and because Macron is new to this. He thought he could take care of Trump for Merkel. Trump does not like Merkel at all. We can talk about the psychology of his feeling about the woman chancellor.
You think gender has something to do with it?
I do. I
was asking rhetorically.
Yes, I know. I was answering rhetorically.
Yes, I know.
So I think that Macron just doesn't have the bona fides or the experience to do it.
You're dropping a lot of French there.
Yeah. So she's still going to be the most powerful, I think, for some time, just because there isn't much of an alternative.
By the way, everybody's weaker.
Yes.
It is really stunning. Everybody's weaker. I could argue even she feels weaker, like because she doesn't have that influence over North Korea.
Well, she is about to use this 19th Party Congress to put himself up on a pedestal like close to Mao.
Yeah.
No,
so
he's the only one rising.
Well, Putin feels a lot stronger today than 17
Yes.
years ago, for sure. Just some data on this same point. The Pew polls that Wendy was quoting earlier, they're great to look up. I highly recommend them. They just did a survey of 37 countries. Only in 2 is our approval rating better than it was during the Obama administration, Israel and Russia. And of those countries, 7 of our allies trust Putin more than they trust Trump today.
And full disclosure, I agree with those polls. My husband leads that project. So.
I didn't know that.
Jeremy, let me get you to do this next question. You because I believe you have some partners in your company that have been Republican administrations. And this person underlines the word horrible. In the horrible event of impeachment followed by conviction, do you think President Pence would bring a more traditional approach to foreign policy?
Yes.
What evidence do you have?
I think he is more in the mainstream of the conservative Republican tradition. I think he would probably be an internationalist.
UN skeptic, but an international.
Yeah, an internationalist, not as much of a nationalist. He may have strong skepticism of the Iran deal and continue the realignment in the Middle East we talked about. I think he probably would get tougher on Russia. And I think he would want to build up the military in the same way that the current administration is doing.
Admiral, why don't you tackle this one? Now that the U.S. has all the oil it can frack and as many religious extremists as can find their way to a polling place, why can't this country just quit the Middle East? Do you believe that jihadists would continue to target our neighborhood if we simply extricated ourselves from theirs?
Yeah, this is the larger question of the world is a mess. Let's just please come home and
Middle East is
everything
even
will be
messier.
better.
Yeah.
And there is, let's face it, enormous Middle East fatigue out there. And I think the public kind of conflates it all. It's Sunnis and Shias and Palestinians and Turks and Israelis and Afghanis, and it's all one enormous mess, is sort of the conventional view. And so there's a very seductive course that says, boy, let's just pull back. But again, historically, when we do that, we're a loser. We are, in the end, we'll see greater forces that come after us in our own country. And by the way, we're not fracking oil, we're fracking natural gas. Yeah.
Right. Well,
I know. You're translating the questions, right.
And let me, all right, make the Obama administration veterans over here answer this one. How do you explain President Obama's failures in Syria? And what should have we done? What should have we done differently? Wendy?
Well, I've been public about the fact that I would have done things differently than the president did, though I understood why he made the choices he did. And they go to what Jeremy said earlier about the desire of the Americans and the Obama administration to pull back in some ways, that this was some retrenchment. People were tired of Afghanistan and tired of Iraq. They thought Iraq was a terrible mistake, which I believe it was, and that we really ought to pull back. And so he knew that the American public and the American Congress did not support sending America's finest to Syria. And so he was very deliberative about it. He wanted to make sure the Congress was behind him, and clearly the Congress wasn't. The Congress wasn't going to support a strike any more than David Cameron could get the British Parliament to support military action. And we should have understood that much earlier. I was in the State Department with John Kerry and watched him make that fabulous speech on Friday, and we all went home Friday night.
It was Winston Churchill. I didn't know Kerry had that in him.
Truly thinking, this is fantastic. America is going to act. We are going to take a strike tomorrow. We all came into the State Department very early on Saturday morning.
Yeah, a lot of us came in very early on Saturday morning, too.
Yes. And Kerry brought a few of us together, and he said, guys, we're not going to do it.
The president took a walk.
Yeah, the president and Dennis McDonough
kinda
took a walk.
Took a walk on the
Talk-
South
Took
Lawn.
a walk in the woods. Those walks in the woods don't work out very well. So,
Then he took a flight to St. Petersburg. We were there together.
Yes.
so you know, I do think we should have taken that strike. I do think we should have armed earlier. But there were serious problems. The opposition was not coherent. The opposition was complex. The connection between the political and the military wings, such as they were of the opposition, were not knitted together. We didn't have the clarity we needed. And there's this little problem called the law. We took strikes in Syria because the Iraqis asked us to protect their border from ISIS. So a sovereign country asked us to take those strikes. But what was the legal authority for us to attack Assad?
Conventional. What about the issue of the chemical weapons treaty?
Well,
Didn't we have an obligation to enforce it?
well, I believe we should have taken that strike. What happened?
That would have been our legal. Would that have been our legal cover?
That would have been. We would have asserted that's what we were doing, and on behalf of the international community. And there was action at the Security Council about the chemical weapons strike. So we would have had, sort of like the Balkans, we would have had legitimacy, if not legality. But that isn't what happened. And then ultimately, because of a series of rhetorical statements, we got to the chemical weapons agreement instead. But it was a missed opportunity.
I think a couple of you wanted to jump in here. Go.
So we were just talking backstage. I just finished writing a book. Invite me back in the spring. The longest chapter in that book is about Syria because it is really tragic. Yeah, it's hard.
Is Syria going to be? And this isn't a weird. And I don't.
Yes,
What
it is.
Rwanda was to Clinton. Is Syria going to be Obama's?
I think it's
Rwanda?
much worse than Rwanda, with all due respect.
Wow.
Yeah, of course.
His
And
great-
I don't
his
wanna
biggest
refer-
failure then is what.
Well, but I've had this conversation with the president from time to time, and I want to underscore a couple of things. I won't go into the we should have because Wendy just did. I have a few more in the book, but two
Can you
things.
pre-order that book on Amazon?
Any day now,
Yeah.
any day. But I would say two big things about in the president's proclivities and then American power more generally. So one, you mentioned a few proximate things, but also remember Libya. Libya happened. Had Libya been a better outcome, there's no doubt in my mind that we would have had a different strategy vis-a-vis Syria. I was working at the National Security Council at the time. Those things are causally related in the president's mind. He became much more skeptical about people coming in to tell him about the good things that are going to happen through the use of force or the CIA program in Syria as a result of that, of what happened in Libya. So that's number one, and he would want you to know that if he were here. But number two, he was skeptical. I think his worldview about us having the ability to affect things, he was much more skeptical about those arguments across the board. I was of a different view. Like Wendy, I was like, what is the harm? Okay, there's the legal argument. I remember that, but we violated that many times in our history, by the way. Who was going to argue with us about taking military strikes against a guy that just killed hundreds of children with chemical weapons? I wasn't worried about that. I thought, roll the dice with force. It may not change anything. That's important. But it may change things for the better. And think about that. The president was worried about the
You didn't
second.
think there was much of a downside?
I did not. I
Thought
did
it
not.
was either neutral or upside.
I did not. Now, there was the intervention of Putin right in the middle of this story. The president flew to St. Petersburg. He met with Putin, and it didn't happen on the spot. There had been a lot of legwork done before this, but that's when the moment that he said, let's do this chemical weapons deal. And the president, rightly, I understand his logic, said, we've got a deal in the hand here that will make our allies in the region safer, maybe make Syrians safer, versus a lot of uncertainty about military strikes. And, that was...
I'd be curious what Jeremy
Yeah, it was
and
just-
the Admiral
this
military
Really?
This
has
really
to say about this.
This really sort of, this is going to be debated at the Obama Presidential Library years and years and years. Jeremy?
It was the wrong call.
What part? Which part though? Was it the red line? Was it the when did it? How did it become the wrong
I'm just
call?
trying to give a succinct answer because we've heard a lot of analysis. It was the wrong call not to enforce the red line that the United States of America had set. And I think the downsides would have been minimal and the upsides would have been big. And we allowed...
Right to draw the red line.
I was comfortable. Yes, it was, because that is a norm that we should make clear, and I believe in clarity, that others can't cross without consequences.
I'm simply going to agree with Jeremy's point. I would add, without dragging the audience through international law, which is a morass, I think there is sufficient international legal support for this, and that's what I do at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I want to hit a bigger bell. I think Obama's bigger mistake was pulling the troops out of Iraq. Took 15,000 troops out. He could have concluded a SOFA agreement, in my view, or he could have continued to operate without it. If those 15,000 troops had stayed there, I believe we would not have seen the rise of the Islamic State. I think that's a bigger miss than the red line.
Where is Syria today? And where is Syria today?
Syria today is about to be partitioned and fall apart as a state.
No. What I mean, because the one beget the other. So you're saying pulling the troops out of Iraq, that created the vacuum that created ISIS. If we don't pull the troops out of Iraq, what is the state of Syria?
Oh, I think at that point, you would not have seen the rise of the Islamic State in Syria. Now, here you have a separate question, because Syria is falling apart not because of the rise of ISIS, but because of the Arab Spring and the uprising against Assad. I think Syria could not be worse than it is today. So the real question is, if our objective today is the destruction of the Islamic State, and you wind the clock back, where could we have stopped that and put a stake in its heart? I'd argue it would have been to have remained longer, minimal troop level, 15,000 in Iraq, and we were prepared to do that.
Chuck, am I just remembering now? Aren't you responsible for the red line? Yes, just for everybody who remembers that, I just remembered.
And it was the Todd Aiken press conference. If you trust me, okay, so I'll just give you a quick backstory. It was 2012, August. Todd Aiken, a Senate candidate in Missouri, the weekend before.
The forerunner to Mr. Moore.
Forerunner, he makes, Todd Aiken is John McCain compared to Roy Moore. But Todd Aiken did this whole issue of rape, and you can't get pregnant if you're raped and all this stuff, and it becomes this. And the president clearly wants to weigh in. But he can't just do it. He needs somebody to ask him a question. So lo and behold, at our press briefing that day, the president decides every once in a while they do that, especially during the election year, so he could just take questions. And, a reporter asked me about Todd Aiken. And he wanted to tie Todd Aiken. So, you go through, and AP always gets the first question, so AP dutifully asks the president the Todd Aiken. He comes out with some mealy-mouthed statement about the economy or something, but it was an excuse to do Todd Aiken. So the first couple of questions about the campaign. I happen to get the fourth or fifth question. I think, I'm not going to ask about the campaign. I'm going to ask about Syria. And I'm going to ask about this chemical weapons issue. We haven't done it. We haven't heard from the president in a while. And I never said red line. I never said any of that. I just asked about Syria. He went to red line on his own during a follow-up. But this is how you have a reporter like myself who's fourth or fifth, and the main questions are done, but you have to keep staying out there because you've agreed to take some questions because you wanted to score points on Mitt Romney and Todd Aiken. And guess what? He now has the worst chapter in his book with the red line.
Started by Chuck Todd.
Apparently started by me. Thanks for bringing that up, Mike. I wrote that in my book. By the way, I wrote that whole thing in my book, which is available on Amazon. The Stranger, Barack Obama in the White House. Buy it today. The final question here it's a nice simple one, but I'm going to expand upon it. It was, what can we do? They were referring to themselves.
Great question.
You guys were talking about this. And I want to expand upon it this way because we've been talking about it. The future of liberal democracy. Is it on the rise, or are we, what you guys were just describing with China? What if people see China's version of free market authoritarianism as the easier way to run a country? I hate to put it in those terms. Are people going to gravitate to that? Is the future of liberal democracy at stake now? And if that's the case, is that what we can do?
Why don't you start?
Well, Churchill said, you know this quote, that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And I think if you look at the long throw of history, go back 100 years ago, there were 12 democracies on the planet Earth. Go back 70 years ago, there were about 35. Today, there are about 160, depending on how you measure. The long throw of history, I think, moves toward democracy, point A. Point B, how do we continue it? I think it's what all of us do. It's in service for our nation, and I'm optimistic about the country. I believe that despite these challenges, when we look at what the United States continues to bring to the table, we have a leadership role to play, and I think that democracy will get battered, but it will continue to move forward. And I'll close by saying India, a point I made earlier, nation of 1.5 billion people, in their last election, 870 million people voted. Now, we have a population of about 300 million. We turned out about 100 million. India had 870 million people vote. I think it's unstoppable. China has a different system, but over time, the lack of a safety valve, because that's what democracy is, it's the safety valve when internal pressures build up, I think will handicap China, and I don't see other nations ultimately following that path.
Is any of you less optimistic?
Well, I'm not less optimistic, but you all asked what you could do. I'm a huge believer that we have to get back to something as simple as civic education in this country.
My daughter's in the 8th grade, and I don't feel like she's been taught the Bill of Rights.
Exactly. So,
By the way, out of fear, I think school systems fear now teaching civics, out of political polarization.
well,
and all.
then that's what every parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, sister, brother in this audience, which we all are, can do. Jeremy raised this backstage about whether we were going to get to a conversation about our democratic values and the tenets of who we are. And I think what we need to do is advocate that schools go back to teaching this starting in elementary school. One of the things I've suggested to the educational institutions I'm affiliated with, I'm a non-resident fellow at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School at Harvard, is that why we have undergraduates and graduate students go live abroad because we think that's important. I want every national security professional to have to make a home visit, and not to their own neighborhood, but some other neighborhood in this country, and sit down with the PTA and the Kiwanis Club and partner up with a community college and learn, how does that community relate to the rest of the world? Where do their exports and imports come from? How much do they travel? What do they know? And listen, not just tell them what is out there in the world, but listen to people's thoughts about the world, their anxieties about the world, and the strength of who we are as a country. So I think we have a lot of self-education to do to remind ourselves who we are, what we believe in, what makes us strong, and it is incumbent on all of us not just to have the conversations on the East Coast, not just to have, it's one of the things that MSNBC does by talking to a larger audience, but we all have to reinvest in civic education. Huge believer.
I think Mike's going to be more pessimistic than Jeremy, so I'll let you sound a little bit of the alarm.
No, I'm a huge optimist. I was born in Montana. We're all optimists in Montana. I want to speak as a professor and then as a citizen, okay? So put my professorial hat on. The debate we have when we talk about the prospects of the future of democracy, there are two big theories. One's about modernization theory. The more well-to-do a society, the more likely it is to become democratic. And that's been true for 200 or 300 years. That trend, those countries that you just listed, you can look at it and you can see that trend's pretty healthy. But there's another theory, which has to do about the balance of power in the international system. The same correlation that you talked about was also the rise of American power. And what happens if we become a diminished power and disengaged power? What happens to the prospects for Democrats in places that are not democratic, especially when today there is an alternative political system that's offering an alternative path? And it's real. And it's an ideological alternative path that we, because we don't listen to it very closely, are not very in tune in it. But if you travel in other parts of the world, they are very in tune to it. China is offering a different model. Now, I'm not optimistic about the China model. I think they're going to face the same problems that all industrial and post-industrial societies have before. But the other ones that faced it in a time when we were engaged in the world. The Taiwanese, the South Koreans, the Philippines, the Chileans, they all went through that transition when we were a hegemonic power engaged in the liberal international order. It feels a little more shaky right now. And that's why you got to be engaged. Just to jump in, we're talking about very abstract things, what you can do. You can be engaged just like you are right now, but also go to Tulsa, go to an event like this in Montana, engage on somebody on Twitter. If you can't go to Montana, engage on Facebook, because we're not having that conversation. The thing that I think most Americans are purple. They're not red and blue. The data actually shows that, by the way. It's not just my opinion. Fiorina and Brady, if you want to look it up and Google it, they have a great study on this. But our elites feel real red and blue right now, and that scares me because polarization is not good for democratic renewal.
I'll talk as a dad. This morning at the breakfast table, I asked my third grader, who was on flag duty this week, I said, Becca, what does the flag mean to you? She said, well, it's 13 and 50. It's the 13 colonies we started as. It's the 50 stars, the states we are today. And it's all about coming together as a country. I thought that was pretty good.
Good for you.
And I
Stop
thought,
right there.
And I thought to myself,
Phew.
I thought to myself, there are many ways to honor that flag, that unity, that ideal, that union. In my view, it's a tragedy that the person who would denigrate the reverence for the flag would do so by defending the honor of Confederate statues and people who sowed division when those individuals attacked the flag, attacked our country, attacked the United States of America. And our strength, Chuck, in my view, is the fact that we are United States, that we are one union, and that if we can come together, e pluribus unum, out of many we can come together as one. That, I think, will be the great strength of our country going forward.
It's a nice way to end.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep. How about these? Pretty cool to spend 90 minutes with all this brain power on stage. So thanks for making us all feel a little smarter tonight, guys. Big round of applause. Thank you. And don't forget, you can always watch all of them on MSNBC.